और आज जो कार्यक्रम है वो 19वां सफदर हाशमी मेमोरियल लेक्चर है और पहली बार ये लेक्चर इस स्टूडियो सफदर में हो रहा है। मैं हमारे इस सभा की जो सदारत करेंगी गीता हरिहरन, उनसे गुजारिश करती हूँ कि वो आए और सदानंद मेनन जो इस लेक्चर को आपके सामने रखेंगे वो भी प्लीज़ आए। प्लीज़ कम। आज के लेक्चर का जो शीर्षक है वो है न्यू इमेजिनरीज इन कल्चरल एक्टिविज्म, और ये एक तरह से देखा जाए तो सदानंद मेनन जो इस लेक्चर को आपके सामने रखेंगे उनके ज़िंदगी के काम का सार है एक तरह से। वो बहुत ही वैसे तो जाने माने हैं, लेकिन शायद हमारे कुछ जो युवक साथी हैं वो शायद न जानते हों। दरअसल सदानंद मेनन हमारे जननाट्य मंच के साथ और दिल्ली में जो सांस्कृतिक गतिविधियां होती रही हैं उसके साथ बहुत उनका एक रिश्ता रहा है। समय था जब वो यहाँ पे नौकरी करते थे और मेन स्ट्रीम अखबार जो है उसके अंदर कल्चर के लिए पर्याप्त जगह हो अखबार के अंदर, उसके लिए उन्होंने ना सिर्फ कोशिश की लेकिन वो उसको करवा भी पाए। तो जब तक वो यहाँ थे वो एक कल्चर पेज होता था इकोनॉमिक टाइम्स में भी और अन्य अखबारों में भी, और सदानंद ने इस चीज़ को बहुत अच्छे से कामयाबी से उसको किया था। आज तो कल्चर नहीं एंटरटेनमेंट होता है। कल्चर पेज उस तरह से फिर से संकुचित हो गया है, फिर छुटपुट कहीं पे दिखता है। सदानंद जो है वो राजनीति और संस्कृति इसका जो एक रिश्ता है, और ये रिश्ता बहुत आसान रिश्ता नहीं है और कोई सरल रिश्ता नहीं है और सीधा सीधा भी कोई रिश्ता नहीं है, लेकिन इस रिश्ते के अलग अलग आयाम जो हैं उसको एक्सप्लोर कर रहे हैं और उसके अंदर उसके बारे में वो लिखते आए हैं और कई जगह पे भी वो बोलते आए हैं। वो पढ़ाते हैं, लिखते हैं, आलोचक हैं। मैं वो कहाँ पढ़ाते हैं उसका मैं नाम नहीं दे रही हूँ, बहुत लंबी फहरिस्त है और थोड़ा सा एम्बैरेसिंग हो जाता है, उन्होंने मुझसे कहा था इसलिए। और जाने कितने एडवाइजरी पैनल्स और एकेडमीज़ के और कमिटीज़ के वो मेंबर हैं, जाहिर है वो तो होंगे ही, और बड़ी अच्छी बात है क्योंकि वो जो है जिस चीज़ को इस किस्म के एपिक्स बॉडीज़ में रख पाते हैं वो शायद बहुत कम लोग कर पाते हैं। कि वो जो है एक तरफ से उनका इतना एक इमेज है, उनका इतना स्टेचर है कि इन बॉडीज़ में उनको जगह मिलती है और वो बात करते हैं इसी चीज़ के बारे में जो आज बोलने जा रहे हैं, कल्चरल एक्टिविज़म के बारे में। तो ये जो है ये एक बहुत ही ख़ास चीज़ है सदानंद के बारे में। वैसे सदानंद जो है वो डांस में उनका एक बहुत दखल है। चंद्रलेखा जिनके बारे में आप लोग जानते हैं, उनके काम के साथ बहुत उनका अभिन्न रिश्ता रहा है, और सिर्फ रिश्ता ही नहीं लेकिन इस तरह से टेक्निकल डायरेक्शन भी उन्होंने की है उन परफॉर्मेंसेस की। बहुत उनको पुरस्कार भी मिले हैं। मैं कोई उसकी लंबी चौड़ी फहरिस्त नहीं बोल रही हूँ, लेकिन बहुत मुझे खुशी है क्योंकि एक ज़माना था जब जननाट्य मंच से सफदर अखबार में लिखते थे और वो इसीलिए लिख पाते थे और उनको एक कॉलम मिला था क्योंकि सदानंद ने इस बात को पहचाना था कि हमारे जैसे जो काम हो रहा था जिस तरह से उसकी भी एक झलक और एक आवाज़ अखबारों में होनी चाहिए, और उसी के आधार पर वो अच्छा रहा था क्योंकि फिर हम भी अपने काम के बारे में ज़्यादा सोचते रहे और सफदर जो है वो अच्छा लिखने लगा। तो आई थिंक दैट्स रियली थैंक्स टू यू फॉर हैविंग पुश्ड हिम फ्रैंकली। थैंक यू वेरी मच फॉर कमिंग टुडे। गीता जी जो हमारे इस सभा की सदारत करेंगी वो जानी मानी लेखिका हैं और वो कंटेम्प्रेरी इंडियन फिक्शन में एक बहुत बड़ी हस्ती हैं। एडिटिंग का भी काम करती हैं और उनके बहुत सारे किताबें जो हैं, उनका पहला जो नावल था वो पुरस्कृत हुआ था। और गीता भी जो है वो सिर्फ किसी एक कमरे में बैठ के लिखती नहीं है, वो यहाँ ज़मीन पे क्या हो रहा है उसके साथ उनका एक बहुत स्ट्रॉन्ग रिश्ता है। तो इसीलिए इस लेक्चर के जो स्पीकर हैं और जो चेयर कर रही हैं वो दोनों जो हैं क्लियरली इस पूरे माहौल के साथ एक बहुत उनका एक सिर्फ रिश्ता ही नहीं है, उनका शायद एक कंट्रीब्यूशन भी है इस चीज़ में। थैंक यू वेरी मच। गीता, प्लीज़ टेक ओवर।
The Safdar Hashmi Memorial Lectures have, over the years, enriched us with all kinds of insights into issues of contemporary concern. But I think today is a special lecture, not only because Sadananad Menon is delivering it, but because of the subject. I think it's entirely appropriate that a Safdar Hashmi Memorial Lecture should be about the intricate transactions between culture and politics, because I think both his life and work showed us in many ways that culture, if it does not rest firmly on a substructure of politics, is actually some sort of Neverland kind of culture. It's only a tiny part of culture. And political practice that does not anchor itself firmly in the realm of cultural politics is, in fact, not paying adequate attention to the structure of our collective social lives. So I think the subject is extremely important. The title, which I think is an extremely eloquent title, gives us an idea of the range of things we might expect to hear about this evening. First, of course, there are certain assumptions that I think we will make about this thing called culture that we hear about all the time from all kinds of unlikely people. Clearly, I think we're agreed that culture is not static, that culture is not an ostrich, despite what some people say, that it is a living thing, it is dynamic, and it's mutable, and finally, that it actually belongs to whoever partakes of it and who lives it. So that, I think, is the nature of culture. Then, of course, we go to the next stage. If we are talking about the multiplicities which really make up the nature of culture, then you're assuming that culture cannot be narrated, cannot be experienced without a range of narratives. So you cannot have just the official narrative of culture. You have to have an entire system and a counter system, narratives and counter narratives. And what happens to this system of alternate narratives? How do these flourish? And essentially, that is what I think we're talking about when we talk about cultural activism, certain modes of engagement which help us not only to understand these counter narratives, but actually to fashion constantly new narratives as the times change, as the challenges change, and so on. So I think if we think in terms of modes of engagement, the fact that we not only need to react to official narratives, those who reduce culture to either an official thing or to a trivial thing or to something that is identified with the majority and so on, but also, in addition to response, the next step, of course, is for us to set the terms of reference if you are going to fashion counter-narratives. And I think that is where we are hoping to hear from Sadananad Menon about how we might actually work on these imaginaries which will help us work towards a more living, dynamic culture.
We are unlikely, I think, to engage in a quarrel here if I were to suggest that culture has come to occupy a special connotation as one of the most abused words in service today. Activism, too, has turned viral and is on many lips and many CVs. Consequently, cultural activism has traveled in time to emerge now as a fashionable label in vogue among upwardly mobile urbanistas. I am personally prone to severe accidents these days, as I frequently bump into cultural theorists and cultural activists at every seminar. The results are often severe. This is a contemporary hazard created by the rapid transition of the idea of both culture and activism from their location in the active contradictions of day-to-day life to become disengaged from any notion of transformative politics. When Walter Benjamin proposed in his thesis on the philosophy of history, and I quote, that there is no document of culture that is not at the same time a document of barbarism, he was pointing towards the need for acknowledging this tension critically through active engagement with the manipulations of power through culture. And as Michel Foucault has suggested, forms of state power and hegemony have become so capillary and so permeated, and have permeated so deep in our own pores and co-opted us that it has almost become incumbent upon us to wake up every morning and ask oneself the question, what tyranny, what terrible infamy am I going to endorse today? And then proceed to work the whole day against it. Almost against oneself, as it were. Cultural activism is about critiquing culture, which means oneself, not about endorsing it. It was this kind of a quiet and self-critical person I met over a quarter of a century ago during an artist initiative at the Rabindra Bhavan lawns here in Delhi, where several well-known artists of the city were sprawled around creating posters for communal amity. His name was Safdar Hashmi, and he was clearly a cultural activist who did not need to call himself one. Interestingly, I too perhaps had some such identity, self-identity those days. It merely meant, in one of my friend G.P. Deshpande's formulations, doing the political culturally. It was a time when we still believed that art could be revolution by other means. What I'm interested in exploring today is what has changed in the 25 plus years that have passed. I'm privileged to have been invited to deliver this Safdar Hashmi Memorial Lecture, the 19th one, and thank all the constituents of the Jannati Manch and Mala Hashmi and Sudhanva in particular for their comradeship. And thank you, Geeta, for creating the frame that we are going to be discussing within. The cultural activist has both a charismatic and a romantic provenance from the early years of the 20th century. If Leon Trotsky imagined the idea in 1905, his very famous book of the 1905 uprising, Georgy Plekhanov discusses that in Art and Social Life in 1912. Rosa Luxemburg discusses that in the Dialectics of Spontaneity and Organization, and the tension between the two that bring up the idea of cultural activism. Lunacharsky talks about cultural task of the struggling proletariat in 1918, and the poet Mayakovsky gives it a body for the Bolshevik Revolution. The critical oxygen for all this came from the anarchists like Emma Goldman and Nestor Makhno, who were not averse to artistically challenging any and every manifestation of power, even in a radical party. They remained ever suspicious of power, divested of both accountability and aesthetics. By the mid-1920s, the idea of both politics and governance as a daily form of artistic and creative self-renewal began to consolidate itself, fueled by L. Lissitzky, Kazimir Malevich, Vsevolod Meyerhold, Sergei Eisenstein, and Maxim Gorky's clearer formulations of the artistic avant-garde. It was the start of the Spanish Civil War in 1936 that was to eventually inaugurate the platform for the cultural activist who believed in the power of art to transform and radicalize conventional meanings. The emergence of an artist's front against the advances of fascism quickly converted this into an international phenomenon. In several locations around the world, the plank of cultural activism united the struggles against colonialism, racism, imperialism, and fascism. By the 1940s, this was becoming the motivational force in the liberational movements in Mexico and other centers in Latin America. Here, art became the name of a people's movement triggered by artists like Diego Rivera and his colleagues, later inspired by a Trotsky in exile. André Breton was to write the very famous For an Independent Revolution in the Arts in 1939. In the Indian subcontinent too, it consolidated through a broad and all-encompassing coalition between artists of all persuasions. The Progressive Writers Association and the Indian People's Theatre Association, PWA and IPTA, were merely the organizational face of what was otherwise a larger and deeply participative engagement, a historic moment when artists knew they could set the agenda as well as be part of it. You just have to read Kalpana Shahni's recent little book on Balraj and Bhisham Sahni to realize how broad and infectious this movement was. Simultaneously, the liberation movements in Algeria and other African countries began giving cultural activism its theoretical arm. Inspired by Aimé Césaire and Léopold Senghor, Frantz Fanon articulated the role of culture in revolution, even as Jean-Paul Sartre critiqued oppressive mother cultures. The aroma of the Cuban Revolution and the figures of Castro and Che created the cult of the cultural activist, soon to spread across Latin America, and married to liberation theology and liberation cinema, it coalesced into the fantasized image of an activist who was someone with a camera in one hand and a gun in the other. Meanwhile, from another end, culture was also issuing warning signals. It was turning out to be a hidden persuader and the main ideological weapon for several convergent and divergent political frames, like for Nazism, fascism, for majoritarian nationalism, for bureaucratic and programmatic left party centralism, which has come to be called the Andrei Zhadanov doctrine or Zhadanovism, where he proposed the idea that the only conflict possible in Soviet culture is a conflict between good and best, and that incorrect art is an ideological diversion, and so on. But it also provided ballast for new identity politics, for advanced capitalist consumerism, and for the recent formulations around industrial commodification built into the articulations on creative and cultural industries. In a peculiar inversion in the past 6 decades or so, culture seems to have been aggressively instrumentalized the world over more by regressive forces. There's been a stepping back of the progressives with respect to culture. In our context too, it is formations like the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, the VHP, or the DMK party in Tamil Nadu, or the Shiv Sena in Maharashtra, who seem to have best exploited the mobilizational potential of cultural politics and its hypodermic effects. This has been accompanied in recent years by a parallel swamping of most left liberal cultural platforms and their neutralization by a rabid, resurgent nationalism and the equally poisonous communal polarization. While with the emergency, and for about a decade after that, it did seem possible to build an interrogative space in which art, culture, politics could be substitutive terms. The period best known for the growth of groups and movements like the Jananati Manch in Delhi or Samudaya in Karnataka, the Skills Collective in Madras, of which I was a part, the Odessa Collective in Kerala, the Jananatya Mandali in Andhra Pradesh, the Dalit Vedikes in Karnataka and Maharashtra, the new feminist organizations across the country, and so on. The contemporary scenario is marked by complexities that have not been sufficiently analyzed. It is further complicated by the fact that post-liberalization in the early 1990s, the state too seems increasingly keen to withdraw from the art sector and deliberately seems to be cooling its heels on formulating policies or holding up its own institutions. With the result, the original mandate of the new republic in the 1950s to create a buffer between artists and the market in order to sustain a healthy autonomy of arts practice too has come a cropper. Every state-sponsored arts institution in India today is in a condition of terminal collapse, compounded by both a conceptual and organizational retreat by the collective left. What we are witnessing is a rapid corporatization of cultural spaces and a fragmentation and NGOization of politics. Mass mobilization platforms have been hijacked by communal predators and assorted swamis and yogis on the one hand, or by market spectacles like sports and mega festivals on the other, or by maverick organizations like India Against Corruption. Presumably, they fulfill a role that has not been sufficiently examined by transformative politics. And the so-called autonomous media, which otherwise is presumed to have a critical role, has become an agency that, in Chomsky's famous categorization, ceaselessly labors to manufacture consent. This is how we are now witnessing the reinvention of the cultural activist today as an events manager. So the question needs to be asked, what would cultural activism mean today? Who would it speak to? Who would it stand shoulder to shoulder with? What would be its tools? And importantly, what would be its new imaginary? Can it still gain energy and inspiration from the imaginaries of the first 5 or 6 decades of the last century, which placed the idea of revolution on the agenda and worked with more centralizing concepts like people's democracy or new democracy and so on? Or does it need to find new sources of motivation and strength? The 21st century has seen the emergence of the politics of large ideas and small spaces, facilitated by the individuations made possible by new technologies and their virtual network sites. The new thrust seems to be around autonomy, decentralization, interlinks, debureaucratization, collaboration, and so on. Even as management models seem to become all-pervasive in our daily life, cultural resistance seems to reject the inherent control implied in these models. What is emerging as necessary is to be able to find new ways to bypass street and state censorship, forms of both of which have become significantly voluminous. The old idea of radical optimism seems to be in dire need today, and an unexplored area by earlier radical cultural formations, which is to learn, understand, reinterpret, and recover spaces in tradition without handing it over on a platter to the communal element, is imperative. It is this kind of work, for example, that my colleague Chandralekha did in dance, which I suspect has still not been comprehended by progressive friends. One can sense this by the way mention of her work is studiously avoided in debates around radical artistic contributions. G.P. Deshpande's critique of this has been severe. He says in his EPW essay on the progressive cultural movement that culture policy for the left is nostalgia of the 40s, particularly its response to the worsening communal situation. And I quote GPD, The rhetoric employed by the fundamentalist and the chauvinistic forces has changed, become more complex and even sophisticated. Its seductive quality is undeniable. In comparison, the progressive pundits seem to be at their wits' end and sound indisputably tired. There is no recognition of a possibility that we might be fighting a losing battle. End quotation. Or as he says in another place, in fact in the first Safdar Hashmi Memorial Lecture, and I quote, "All ideas relating to culture have to be critically appropriated. Celebrating the tradition and using the tradition to ask ourselves certain new questions is what the left radical agenda should have been." That's a very big should, and it's left hanging in the air. There certainly have to be new intellectual and theoretical engagements on several fronts. For example, in an era of religious revival and the spread of neo-mysticism in epidemic proportion, which what we are witnessing today, one would certainly like to see a greater re-engagement with the idea of both theism and atheism. The proletarian alone cannot be the focus of concern, particularly in an era when organized labor seems to have been co-opted into the larger committee of corporate organization and patronage, leading to a decline of the agency of trade unions. The poor too need to be addressed, considering this majority unorganized sector is what is under the worst attack in our times. So too, largely unaddressed issues of gender, caste, and tribal alienation, and the aggressive poaching on natural resources in tribal zones by metropolitan capital, and the resultant ecological environmental degradation can only be integral to any form of cultural resistance. To me, it's quite ironic that in the last 40 years, Badal Sarkar has been the only playwright to have addressed the issue of nuclearization in his 1968 play Tringja Shatabdi. Urbanism, youth subcultures, nationalist jingoism, media as the new missionaries of global capitalism are all areas that need special address. Since schools and universities are no longer incubators of critical consciousness, never has the need for working directly with the youth been more acute. This possibly entails creating democratic cultural meeting spaces or addas, somewhat like this, which can help de-insulate the younger citizens from social realities. While all these are crucial, the task gets more problematized now with the World Bank and UNESCO inspired global thrust on the idea of cultural diversity. World Bank President James Wolfenson's document on the importance and necessity of including the idea of cultural diversity in all development planning influenced UNESCO to come up with its 2001 Declaration on Cultural Diversity, and then its 2005 Convention on the Protection and Promotion of Diversity of Cultural Expression, which seeks to vest the idea of culture in both state and in both state and market processes. I am basically suspicious of such agendas. The more the term cultural diversity pops up from various official fora, the more one smells a certain kind of reductionism. It actually becomes the opposite of diversity and undergoes a kind of paring down or reduction. In the current policy environment around the discourse on cultural diversity, one senses a neat surgical split on the drawing boards of the Planning Commission along two axes: information and entertainment. The issue of cultural diversity gets funneled into these two matching and seemingly symbiotic twinned halves. Over the past few years, the issue of cultural diversity, along with the idea of creative and cultural industries, has entered the Indian discourse via the 11th plan. Interestingly, when you read the draft document, which mercifully has not yet got past the draft stage, it reads like some of the old colonial documents. It uses phrases like, culture is an arm of diplomacy, or what cannot be measured cannot be managed, and so on. These are mantras woven into the fabric of the entire discourse. It does set up a series of alarm bells with respect to where exactly the whole thing is going. But interestingly, stemming from the World Bank UNESCO route and the manner in which it has entered the Indian planning discourse, the suggestion seems to be that cultural and creative industries are the last natural resource for the developing world. Every other resource seems to have been exhausted. This remains the last natural resource available to be opened up for global extraction and exploitation. They also suggest how this could be done. In countries like India, as in other South and South Asian countries, much of this sector has existed in the old grant subsidy model. The move today is to specifically transform it into what is called the revenue model, and thereby convert cultural diversity into a supply side window. The corollary to this is equally disturbing, because it then takes culture directly into what is called cultural assets management. In fact, the draft document proposes the setting up of 2 universities, one in North India and one in South India, to focus exclusively on cultural assets management. What one sees happening is really interesting. Through the Planning Commission, one witnesses the creation of new task forces and perhaps a new ministry which will look at this whole sector as an area of management for wealth extraction and global exchange. Yet, if one looks at in real terms at the kind of state investments made over the past 15 odd years in the cultural sector, the scale of retreat is almost on par with a disinvestment policy. If some of the recent computations, for example by Price Waterhouse, are to be believed, out of every 100 rupees the government of India spends, 19 rupees goes for defense. In comparison, culture gets only 16 paise. Also, in the last 15-year period, the expenditure on defense rose from 16.6% to 18.8%, indicating a substantial rise in the allocation on defense, whereas allocation on culture has actually declined. This is also the same period when the Indian cultural basket has been dramatically inflated by the entry of major foreign players. All the global mega entertainment giants now have a presence here through the media and the entertainment sector. Walt Disney, Bertelsmann, News Corp, you name it, they're all here. Sony. The state, instead of being a buffer and putting in place protectionist policies, has withdrawn completely and offered a red carpet welcome to these foreign players. Now, recently in retail and insurance, at least they announced it, and there is a fight over it. In culture, it is entirely surreptitious. What one is then witnessing is this new negotiation of cultural power that now enables corporate multinationals to inveigle themselves into the nation's economy and markets through the Parliament and the Planning Commission, which are in fact supposed to be filters against this kind of assault. It's what I would call a Trojan horse syndrome, where the global players enter the national planning discourse in a masked garb. One can say then that in the era of entertainment and the spectacle economy, policing culture is out and policying culture is in. Like the UNESCO declaration states unambiguously, support for cultural industries should be redefined as investment in development. This to me is the most dangerous element in the discourse. Now the question is, what sort of a new imaginary will we need to come up with to resist, tackle and defeat this? Are we up to it? Have we done our homework? Are our minds and bodies ready for the challenge? Have we renewed and sharpened our politics? Historically, progressive cultural activism has always failed when it has remained merely ideological. It has to abandon its exclusionary nature and engage in the development of a new critique. It has to help in the generation of new and autonomous cadre with both depth and bandwidth that becomes a vanguard of progressive politics when progressive politics is itself in its moment of decline. That, I believe, is the challenge before us. Thank you.
Sadananad, I actually want to use the advantage of being the chair and say you've done for us a very thorough and brilliant analysis of the situation. I don't think there's one aspect you left out. But may I be difficult and say that at the end, I think we all agree with what you said at the end, but you know, we are writers, so we want to know what the exact answers are, and I realize there are no exact answers, but do you think we could get a kind of whiff of a concrete imaginary?
Let me begin with an example that not an example, it's an anecdote, it's an incident. Some of you would remember about 18 years ago probably, there was a major incident in Mumbai when one morning residents of Ghatkopar woke up and found Ambedkar statue in that area adorned with a garland of chappals. And of course, immediately it led to rioting and it led to street violence and caste clashes, which left 6 people dead. 2 days later, there was a funeral procession to carry the bodies to the funeral site, which again led to turbulence and again led to loss of life. I think 18 people died, this time in police firing. Now, it kind of triggered a thought in my mind, and I addressed this to fairly well-known thinkers, intellectuals in the Dalit community. The point was this, that if an Ambedkar statue is garlanded with chappals, what constitutes the risibility of the Dalits? Why would they get upset by this? I said, isn't it possible to convert this debate in a slightly different way? Instead of saying we have been insulted, isn't it possible to say, we historically have worked with the leather material. We historically have respected the fact that we are good in this craft. It's part of our bread and butter, it's part of our livelihood. Therefore, we interpret a garland of chappals on our venerable leader Ambedkar as a great honor done to him. And thank you very much for the honor. Now, Mr. Shiv Sena, poor man is gone now, but at that time it was possible to say that, permit us to return the compliment. This is material that we love. We honor it, we work with it. This is our day-to-day sort of engagement. and historically it's been a craft that you're very good at. Let us return the favor back to you. If you give us an audience, we'll also honor you with a garland of chapels. Now, this immediately would change the discourse. Instead of falling for the continuous spiral of violence, counter-violence, being hurt, being injured, responding, taking revenge, you change the terms of discourse. And I think cultural activism would imply being able to, at every moment, change the terms of discourse that whoever is dominant is trying to pose for you at that particular moment. And this has come up recently also. As all of you know that in Parliament there is a bill pending which is called the Manual Scavenging Abolition Act. Now, in the last roughly a month and a half, I must have counted 20 editorials and lead articles in the newspapers, including from very well-known, Dalit intellectuals and friends of mine like Bezwada, Wilson, etc., who are saying this is a great idea, abolish manual scavenging. And I mean, naturally we would say, yeah, fantastic, abolish manual scavenging. But how do you solve the problem of shitting in the first place? How do you abolish manual scavenging without simultaneously being able to create, say, latrines with water and with cleaning facilities across the country? The current statistics shows that something like 900 million people need toilets in this country. So even if you imagine at a scale of one toilet for 50 people, even then you don't have the resources to build that many toilets across the country. So certainly the Dalit community feels hurt, injured, and how do you say, threatened by all these things. If manual scavenging is abolished, they're also going to lose jobs. I mean, that's part of the fear that they have. But at the same time, there is the burden of historic indignity, and that also needs to go. So both are at issue here. Is it possible to change the terms of discourse? Instead of demanding, instead of saying abolish manual scavenging, is it possible to demand that make manual scavenging compulsory for every citizen of this country? If you want admission in St. Stephen's College, in an IIT, in whatever, you must produce a certificate that you've done 50 hours of manual scavenging. If you want to be a professor there, produce a certificate, you have 200 hours of manual scavenging. If you want to be the Prime Minister of the country, you must have done 500 hours. The President, you should have done 800. I'll tell you, within 6 months, this issue is going to get sorted out. Because every scientist who otherwise works for NASA, for this and for that, will get into the act and will try to solve it. So I think the idea of cultural interventions, cultural activism, would be to change the terms of discourse. And for me, that is the sort of simple example that you can think of. In history, we have had some fascinating examples. My favorite story that I love to narrate is of the 1980s, when this man called Saul Alinsky, who was a Russian emigre working in America, and used to work with immigrant labor from Puerto Rico and Mexico and so on, created this very interesting methodology where, like for example, he once went to a Harlem district in New York and found that there was a large number of young people who were unemployed and were into crime and drugs. And upon talking to the elders in the community, it was found that in fact they were all, they'd passed school, they'd gone to college, etc., but they were not getting jobs for various reasons. One of the reasons why they couldn't start their own enterprises was because they didn't have a starting capital. Now the normal thing is, for starting capital, you go to a bank, you take a loan, but they were being denied loans by their local banks. So Saul Alinsky would set up a conversation with the community, and say Monday morning, they would go to the local branch. Imagine a branch, a State Bank of India local branch here in Shadipur, with 10 people sitting behind the counter and so on and so forth. 200 people would queue up from that community with $10 in hand, and all open accounts. It'll take a long time opening account, entering in the register, this, that, and that. We're talking about times before the computer, etc. Lunchtime is gone, again into the afternoon it continues, they all open accounts. Next day morning, the same 200 queue up and close the account. The same amount of time is wasted, and the bank is not able to function. Third day, they've got back the $10. They go and open the account again. And then on the fourth day, a group of elders go to the manager and say, look, we are unemployed. Anyway, you're not giving us loans. And we got $10 in hand. We can do this for the next 2 weeks. Paralyze all our activity. Are you willing to? And we don't have collateral, we don't have houses, we don't have vehicles, we can't put a collateral. But trust us, we are the community, we live here around you. And thereby manage to persuade the banks to open up the loan sectors. And so on. So these are simple ideas and examples. But one needs to work against the system with its own tools. And if you read Naomi Klein, for example, you know how this is happening in the west coast of America, where people are now, it's kind of partly anarchist activity, meaning people climb onto these huge hoardings that have been made by corporate houses, a Mercedes-Benz, the Sony, whatever, and they start defacing those things, but chaining themselves onto the hoarding. And they're very tall, they're 100 feet tall and they're huge, and they go up with their own paint and spray and this and that, and they start vandalizing the hoardings. And by the time the cops arrive in their helicopters and manage to pull them out, they manage to do substantial damage on the one hand. On the other hand, they have shown up corporate America for what it is. And they just change one alphabet in an entire sentence and thereby change the entire meaning of the sentence and so on. It's an activity which is called subvertising. Not advertising, but subverting the advertisement, so they call it subvertising. Now, these are methodologies. But the question is this, as I've tried to point out, the problematic is huge. It's no longer the simple or seemingly simple thing it was even 25 years ago. It's got very, very complex recently. And there are invisible factors in this. There are state factors, there are international factors in this. Lots of things are going on. Within this, one needs to be able to spot that area where you can twist the tourniquet a bit, and if not blood, at least water should drip.
And I think actually your first example, we live in the Republic of Hurt, so everyone can come up with ways of
Abhijit Chakravarti. I have been a journalist for about a decade, but now I'm into education. Now, I teach in a management institute, and you see, these are some observations which I thought I would share here. Now, since I'm into education, certain things which are of grave concern, I thought I would raise in this forum. I've been looking at several schools in Delhi and trying to find out about the humanities departments of these schools. Very interestingly, some very good schools have actually done away with the humanities departments. In 11th, 12th, they only teach science and commerce. The question that comes to my mind is that if there is such a negative kind of treatment towards humanities, how do you expect cultural consciousness to actually grow? That's one observation number one. Observation number two, again a very interesting observation because I was a part of a committee which was trying to relook at the management curriculum being taught in some of the management institutes. And they were trying to kind of build a bridge with social sciences and literature. So I gave them a suggestion, why not have some good Indian writers who are available in translation. My idea was to have Rabindranath Tagore's Gora or Yashpal's Jhuta Sach, which is also available in translation. It was turned down with a very heavy voice, saying that that's not required. We can have literary works, but let's have Indian writers writing in English and not translations. This is second observation. Third observation, I've also been involved with some folk artists in rural West Bengal. When I looked at the census reports, very interestingly, a folk artist, but with some Indian writers writing in English and not translations. This is second observation. Third observation, I've also been involved with some folk artists in rural West Bengal. When I looked at the census reports, very interestingly, a folk artist comes into the category of unorganized labor. Folk art comes under the category of informal work. And the left front government in West Bengal for the last 10 years have been saying that we need to make folk art as a means of sustainable livelihood, and they have done nothing about it. For the past 10 years, they've been talking about it, and now anyway they're out of power. I don't think they'll be able to do it. But in the meantime, since you mentioned about UNESCO and since you mentioned about art being a part of development, some capitalist forces have come into the scenario, especially social entrepreneurs, and they have taken up this idea about folk artists and their sustainable livelihood, and they have done a pretty good job. I'm not saying that they have not done a good job. They have done they have created about 10,000 beneficiaries. But the havoc that they have created in the villages is like something unimaginable. They have class differentiations are like they're there. There are heavy contradictions in terms of gender, etc. So these are the three observations that I thought I would share with you, and if I can have some reaction to it. Thank you.
I'm Elisa from Brazil, Spain. Traveling around, I'm a theater director. Very interested about how we manage to keep creative. And I think one of the forms of resistance that I hear in your words is to keep creative. We are trained to be manipulated also by culture, and it's becoming a little dangerous because I was in an emporium today and I was very, very worried for the craft. Because, okay, you can keep doing what you do if you do what I want to sell from India abroad. All my friends, some of the friends, I really have very little knowledge about India, just few very experience of 2 months. But also I'm extremely worried because many friends I met don't teach their languages to the children. And they are very happy their children only speak English. I couldn't believe it. So I needed the children to help me translate the people, and they cannot talk to the people of their village. So, and they are very happy because it's not the status of the colonialism, or I don't know of what is not colonialism today anywhere. I don't know. So I'm asking myself if something about being human every morning question of your husband would be nowadays maybe how can I keep creative? How can I react to anything I will find in front of me today?
I think that's also something that I mentioned, that how to keep your radical optimism going is one of the tasks. It's not easy. You're constantly under assault, and I can tell you again something that is happening about which very, very little response has come from the rest of society, one wants to call it that. Many of you know the state of Bihar, and one of the main rivers flowing through it, of course, Ganga flows horizontally through it, but vertically, there are at least 6 or 7 rivers that drop into Bihar to join the Ganga coming from the heights of the Himalayan hills, from Nepal mostly. So there is Kamala, Mahananda, Dausa, Kosi, Gandak, Bodhiganda, Gomati, Bhagirathi, so many rivers come in. The story of Kosi is an interesting story. Right from the late 19th century, the Kosi has been known as the sorrow of Bihar because it swings wildly, sometimes over 200 kilometers. In about 10 years, it can travel 200 kilometers this way or that way. In 1928, there was a major flood in Kosi, many people perished, and the then British government went into this issue and said, is it possible to handle this in some way? At that time, there was this attempt to control a similar river happening in China, the Yangtze River, which was called the Yellow Peril. But the Chinese engineers were building embankments on either side. They were allowing the river to flow for a stretch of 5 kilometers. That was all the swing they were permitting, and putting up embankments on either side. So a team of Indian engineers went there, they came back, they suggested that the same thing be done to Kosi. Out of the team of 8 people, only one dissenting was there. There was an Indian engineer called D.P. Singh who said, no, let's not do this, it's a dangerous idea. So just on that one dissenting note, the whole idea was shelved. Post-independence, 1952, once again a major flood happens in Kosi and 500,000 people perish. The first chief minister there was Mishra, Ellen Mishra, and Ellen Mishra tells his water department, go back into the files and find some solution. They dig into the files and they find this 1929 file where 7 engineers have said, let's build embankments, and one has said no. And they said, this is the solution, and they start putting embankments on Kosi River. So 6 feet high, allowing a flow of 2 kilometers on both sides, embankments are built. By the time they build that for a stretch of 40 kilometers, the rivers that are coming from the hills bring silt, and the silt accumulates in the river bed. So the level of the river rises because it can't spread out everywhere. So by the time they finish this, they have to raise the 6 feet embankment to 8 feet, and so on it goes. Then they find that other tributaries coming and joining, Dausa is joining it, Mahananda is joining, so each of them has to be embanked. Today, that part of eastern Bihar is an incredible warren of embankments. Kosi River, somewhere around Madhubani village, flows at a height of 18 feet. The village is here, the river is flowing up there. And of course, every second or third year, the rains are heavy and there's a chance of the river flooding and overflowing and submerging Patna, the capital. So this is the game. Patna should not suffer. So what do? They dynamite one of the walls of the embankment so that the water flows down. Now, for the last 2.5 or 3.5 years roughly, the entire Madhubani village is flooded. I'm using the word Madhubani deliberately, so also I can respond to your concern about folk arts. Madhubani village was known for every single person in that community, particularly women of course, being able to draw and paint. And for every occasion, every rite of passage, every change of season, they would put fresh mud plaster on the walls and draw in a particular manner. In the 1960s, this was discovered by the Indian Cultural Establishment, brought to Delhi. And they were given paper and camlin poster colors to paint on, and they started doing this kind of thing, sitting on the pavements in Janpat and here and there, and became very, very famous, very popular. The Madhubani Mithila paintings are very, very popular. Today, that entire village is submerged. Where are the craftsmen? The craftsmen have all gone on top of the embankment. The embankment has enough width for one jeep to pass. And they have built huts that are slanting on both sides, and that's where they live. How do they live? Their lands are flooded, their agriculture is gone, their cattle stock is gone, some goats are left. How do they live? They cultivate a particular kind of grass which has slightly big seeds. And these seeds are harvested and crushed, and chapatis are made out of this. Hand-to-mouth existence. Only time somebody recognizes them is when elections come. Then these jeeps go up and down with party flags. What is the number of people on top of the embankments? 200, 500, 5,000, 10,000? 2.8 million people are living on top of embankments. Their lands are flooded. Have you seen newspapers talk about this? Have you heard any so-called cultural group, handloom and handicraft board, or any such organization shed tears for those Madhubani artists? Madhubani artists are one. Then you take go a little further, Araria belt and Saharsa and all that. That's the area where the finest singers of Vidyapati chants existed, all submerged. They don't sing Vidyapati anymore. They don't have the time to do that. They're traveling up and down to find some way of survival. So now, tomorrow we want a Madhubani painting. It's a fantastic form of art. Maybe China will give it to you. Maybe but Madhubani artists have perished in one strange way, in a terribly tragic way, without any response from the rest of the society. So this is happening to several folk forms. So either it is co-option into the tourism sector, that will kill it, or it's co-option into the creative and cultural industry sector, which means you commercialize it. That which can sell in the market is only one that will accept. Or you follow the law of the jungle, meaning that which has to die will die. And that's, I think, unacceptable. I think for any kind of progressive thinking, any kind of radical thinking, any kind of transformative thinking, that cannot be allowed. That's not possible. One has to have that beauty. One has to have that creative spirit of these people kept alive, allowed to remain like that, without this kind of tremendous assault from the so-called developmental process. But then, to do that, once again, what is the imaginary? What kind of politics will you be practicing to achieve that? The forces are huge. How will you fight that? What are we demanding then? So I think where cultural issues and livelihood issues intersect, those areas are very crucial to engage in. I think it will be soon extremely necessary for all, even small communities like this, to begin thinking around this and to recalibrate one's own cultural work, one's own political work towards that. And I see that as one of the new directions that we have to seriously work in. Otherwise, political activism, cultural activism is understood as holding a flag, going down a street, doing a march and a demonstration. Take it a little further, make street theatre out of it. But politics can't always be street theatre. It's also a different kind of engagement. It cannot be this programmatic thing. It has to be a different kind of engagement. And while all this work is wonderful and it's small and precious space and it's great and it should be kept alive, I think the whole larger area has to be rethought, has to be integrally rethought to begin to make a new kind of sense to a section of people to whom we have not really reached out.
Sadananad, thank you for a really, really interesting talk. My question, we've talked about this several times, so it's probably familiar, but it's just something that keeps bothering me, the way in which, in some senses, the idea of scarcity and the idea of sustenance. Now, if one were to criticize or critique, let's not say criticize, critique groups which turn so quickly and so easily to the creative and cultural industries model, the thing they turn and throw back at you, how can you say this to us? All we are trying to do is survive. So this whole business about sustenance in some way is the instrument through which this excision is happening. You use that image of excision, which is such a beautiful image, and it is that idea of sustenance, of scarcity, which is actually now pervading the entire cultural atmosphere. I mean, not only the cultural sphere, but every sphere. So all of us are operating under conditions of scarcity. And so politics in a time of scarcity is a huge problem. So anybody who asks the political question becomes a traitor to the cause, becomes somebody who disables rather than enables. And I was wondering if you could help us think about how one might actually enrich the debate so that one is not immediately a traitor.
My name is Shankar, and I'm studying philosophy at St. Stephen's College. See, you're seeing cultural activism as a merely, primarily a political idea. And since it becomes about politics, it sort of becomes about changing people's minds and reaching out to people and etc. Right? And the way I sort of look at the world is that there is a very deep difference between the kind of vocabularies that a certain person uses and the kind of vocabulary another person uses. There's a very deep difference between the right-wing vocabulary and the left-wing vocabulary, for example, or the patriarchal vocabulary and the feminist vocabulary. And to me, it seems as if there's a very antagonistic relationship between the two vocabularies, that there doesn't seem to be, and there are overlaps, of course, but there doesn't seem to be an overlap that can bridge sort of the gaps or sort of, demolish the split between the two. And you said, I've been reading Richard Rorty, who talks about pragmatism and about redescription of things. And you said about how cultural activism should be about how, about redescribing, changing the terms of the discourse. And even in your example of the Dalits and the Mala, and about how they should have accepted it and, change the terms of the discourse, I don't see how that split, that difference in the vocabularies is something, that the demolishing of the difference in the vocabularies or the split is achieved through even changing the terms of the discourse in this particular manner. Because these vocabularies seem extremely antagonistic to each other. And let us assume for this discourse that, that one particular vocabulary, the vocabulary of the oppressed, let's say, of the Dalits in this particular case, is the correct vocabulary, is in fact the morally correct vocabulary. Even then, how is the Dalit, let's say, activist to change the vocabulary of the other, to reach out to ask the other person to change the vocabulary? Yeah.
I won't presume to have answers for all this, but I would say your question, if at all it's a question, is like a non-question, because I don't need to presume, even for a moment, whether the Dalits' perspective is the right perspective or morally preferable perspective or not. You don't need to presume it. It is so. There's no two ways about it. And if you think there is a presumption in this, then I think that's a philosophical problem and not a real problem. So obviously, philosophers need to change the world and not, solve it. Antagonistic vocabularies are what political processes have developed. Right and left, for example, are antagonistic positions. But there are enormous shades in between. Enormous shades of compromise, negotiation, day-to-day life. I can be right and she can be left, and yet it's possible probably to sit like this and talk to each other, etc., etc. How does that happen? Where does it come from? And what are those negotiations that enable that possibility? Would be that space, that area where a certain kind of humanity takes over. And there, it's not the vocabulary that matters anymore, but it's the content of the activism. It's the content of what you are trying to transform. It's no longer based on holding different color flags. So, what I'm trying to say is it possible in this so-called new imaginary, however utopian it might sound, however presumptuous it might sound, however uncooked it might sound, is it possible to imagine that human predicaments can be addressed in certain sane ways, for which the search really is not for vocabulary and terminology, the search is for the common kind of action which can be transformative. And that will create its vocabulary. You don't begin with the vocabulary and then create the action. I'm not going to think of what I'm going to title that thing before I do it. You just have to jump in and do it. So it's a political engagement that when you are doing it day to day, and I'm saying it with groups like Janam, for example, they can go into a situation which is an unknown situation. It's a group of 10 actors, and you have a set play, and you have rehearsed it or performed it, 500 times. And yet, that day is a special encounter. That day is a special situation. That moment is a completely new thing. It just takes you by surprise. And you have to respond to it with your wits, with your mind, with your heart, and so on and so forth. Where you're not going to say, no, my formula is this. At the second minute you enter from the right, and the 5th minute you enter from the left. No, It's a completely different creative engagement. So again, your neighbor talked about how to stay creative. It will be that. It will be how to stay creative. Without getting into the semantics of it. And I would sort of not be too bothered by it. I would not get stymied by the antagonisms of the vocabulary. I think that's a political construct, and it's always possible in cultural work to jump out of that political construct. And this is one of the reasons why, for example, cultural activists always get into trouble with the parties. They're always saying something that the party has said, no, don't do that, don't say that, don't behave in this manner. And you're doing it because that's the action on the ground. And there's always this tension, and people have faced the consequences of it. People have had to apologize, people have had to resign, there have been fights, there have been... The history of cultural activism is full of that. I mean, you just have to see, read that brief period between, say, 1905 and 1915, to read 10 years in the history of the Russian Revolution, to realize how many million different ways of doing things there were, which are being not accepted by this party or that leader or this one or that one, and what all ways were necessary to negotiate that. So I would really not see that as a big issue to be bothered. As for Anita's, it's a problematic that you posed. It's a problematic we all understand. The difficulty of doing any kind of work in situations of scarcity. I mean, one of the examples is that very thing about manual scavenging. I mean, if you say abolish manual scavenging, there are something like 1.8 million people who say, but what about our jobs? It's wonderful, you bring in machines, you bring in this, you bring in that, what about our jobs? What will you do? In Tamil Nadu, I don't know how it's in other places, in Chennai city, for example, the average conservancy worker who goes out in the morning with this little push cart in which there are all these elements, there are spades and buckets and ropes and everything, they are given 15 rupees a day to buy a soap, to buy 100 grams of oil or grease to apply on themselves when they go into those manholes, and to buy, and this is part of the beta they get, to buy camphor and incense stick. Before they dive into the manhole, which is full of muck, a camphor and incense stick is lit, and there's a prayer made to Ganga. Okay, now it's fascinating how this mental, let's say, co-option into a system happens, a Sanskritized kind of thing happens. And yet, one can say psychologically, it's their saving grace. Now, this is what makes them able to do those kind of jobs. Now, would I, as a political activist, try to dissuade them from doing it? Would I say, no, these are superstitious beliefs and don't do it? What would I do? What would be my position in this kind of context? Because these are precisely those contexts of scarcity, of poverty, where it becomes the poor person's job option. What do you do in these situations? It's almost, I mean, this is true even for the army, the soldier, the average soldier in the Indian army, comes from that kind of a background. For him, being in the army is not a patriotic act, it's just a poor man's job option. So while I have an ideological problem with the army and its depredations in Kashmir and Northeast and all that, and its draconian AFSPA powers and all that, I cannot take a position vis-a-vis that soldier, which is anti-human, and you really have to work that out into the politics. And it's a tricky negotiation, you know. The soldier would not be called upon to do that to you, but you would have to be doing that. It's kind of a reverse thing that works. But this is an issue that's, I think, a huge issue, and once again, in every situation, you'll be having a different paradigm within which to engage with it.
Going from his question and yours, as a political activist, coming from a left perspective, I would challenge capitalism in my cinema, in my theatre. The idea is to make it fun. if your every challenge is like a really sad, serious documentary, that was, I think, the greatness of Janam, because I started watching the plays that Janam did when I was like a school kid, and you were laughing and you were joking, but you got radicalized because you realized that not getting a minimum wage was unacceptable. You didn't have to vandalize posters and do things that the Shiv Sena did to make your point. Using creative and good art, like maybe a cinema like B.R. Chopra did, wherein you create heroes from ordinary people, not necessarily things like Amitabh Bachchan in Coolie, beating up people and taking the rule of law in his hand. But political activism has to come from a basic challenge to capitalism. Using theatre, using cinema to challenge class differences and giving dignity to the working class, not necessarily legitimizing work which is dehumanizing.
I'm going to sum that up. I'm not going to let, that's an excellent point. And as somebody a little older, I'm going to say that, I think for cultural practitioners, in a way, have some sort of model, if you can use such an odd word, from a cultural practitioner, for the cultural activist, which is that, of course, you have a political orientation, but that is the room you're sitting in. Once you are actually producing your cultural artifact, once you are being creative, once you're engaging, that is there in the background. And nobody is aware of vocabularies, believe me. No one sits down and writes a novel or a play or engages in a creative act while worrying about what vocab, is this left enough? Or is this too right? Or is this a bit sexist? So your work, your act of resistance, your act of cultural intervention, your act of cultural understanding is informed, I think, by the politics, and it can't be that you go out there and say, I'm going to challenge capitalism. It is not such a direct transaction. I think we'll sum up with that. Thank you so much.
दोस्तों, सदानंद मेनन और गीता जी का बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया, और आप सबका भी कि आप यहाँ आए। ये आपके लिए शायद एक नई जगह है बहुतों के लिए, तो आप ज़रूर आते रहिए। इस स्टूडियो सफदर में, मीडिया कैफे में, बुक स्टोर में अलग अलग कार्यक्रम होते हैं जो आपके मदद से भी होते हैं, तो आप ज़रूर आइए। थैंक यू वेरी मच।